We're going to move on now to the immediate past chairman of the NGA. I was his wingman for a year as vice chair, and he's back here to talk with Governor Polis about broadband innovation. Governor Bullock.
Thanks so much, Governor Hogan. And while many folks think of broadband as an infrastructure issue, it's really one that has to be viewed as a workforce solution for our states as well. Certainly pleased to get to share some of the work that Montana is doing to make broadband connectivity a reality for all of our citizens. If you live in one of Montana's urban areas, it's likely, certainly, that you'll have access to reliable and high-speed broadband. Our best data indicates about 92% of urban Montanans have access to broadband. If you look nationally, it's about 97% of people in urban areas have access to broadband. We also know that high-speed connectivity gives students access to that 21st century classroom, prepares them to live in that rapidly advancing technology-driven market. We also know it's going to foster economic development by supporting small businesses, creating jobs. But if you live in a rural community in Montana, geography, low population, all of it discourages investment by many telecommunications companies. That means only about 59% of rural Montanans have access to broadband and the opportunities that come with it. And this isn't just a frontier state issue. If we look across the country, only about 65% of people in this country in rural areas have access. So during my administration, we've tried to take steps, several approaches to kind of bridge that gap between rural and urban communities. In 2015, the state of Montana and I, we began a partnership with a nonprofit group called Education Superhighway to increase access to affordable high-speed broadband in Montana schools. If I look back then in 2015, only about 3/4 of our schools could access broadband in accordance with the Federal Communications Commission's minimum goals. Over that 5-year period now, 100% of our K-12 students have access to broadband. It's really equipping those schools with that 21st century technology, allowing teachers to be innovative, preparing students to be successful in our modern and changing workforce. In that 5-year period alone, over 60% of our schools have been upgraded to fiber. And for all of our schools, medium bandwidth has increased by nearly 5 times. And we've also been able to then drive down the cost because the median cost of bandwidth has decreased by 76% over that same 5-year period. Now, we know Montana students, whether they live in urban or rural communities, are now receiving the best education possible to be successful in a modern economy. Never forget a trip I took to eastern Montana, a town called Plevna. Could almost be mistaken because it's near Governor Burgum in North Dakota. Has a population of 163 people. Participated in an hour of code with dang near their whole school, which was about a dozen kids. But that 1-hour introduction to computer science is designed to show that anybody can learn the basics and to encourage students to start looking at careers in high-demand fields. And that wouldn't have been possible, certainly, had the school not been equipped with high-speed fiber connections. Those students from that small farming community likely wouldn't have had the same access to computer science coursework as their more urban counterparts. Broadband in our schools is critical to ensuring equity of opportunity for all students. We look at it as a federal investment that, and it's interesting hearing the speaker say about a $3 or $4 trillion infrastructure deficit. Some would say it'd be about $61 billion to get rural connectivity. We still can't wait, though, just for the federal government to take those steps. We've also looked into ways to establish connectivity beyond our classrooms in small towns. Earlier this year, I tasked my lieutenant governor with touring a handful of small Montana towns, identified tangible ways to expand economic opportunities in rural and our tribal communities. We heard from those community leaders and stakeholders about their opportunities, their challenges, look for ways that public or private partnerships could actually assist. And one of the consistent things that we heard was lack of reliable broadband, holding communities back from reaching their full potential. One of those communities is a town called Troy. It's about 1,000 people in northwest Montana. It's indeed a small community, has so much to offer, located on the banks of a river, scenic mountains, attract residents and visitors alike for its abundance of outdoor recreation opportunities. But without broadband, new businesses are really discouraged from establishing themselves in Troy. Growth of any existing businesses is limited and new technologies confined. To address that, we partnered with both our local stakeholders and the Telecommunications Association, brought in Deloitte Consulting to develop what would be a connectivity roadmap outlining the steps to make high-speed, quality broadband a reality for Troy. Creating that map took about 12 weeks of engaging with stakeholders, hosting those planning workshops, but the result was really that framework that laid out the challenges, the approaches to address them, and most importantly, specific next steps to move forward. Funding Toolkit explains the funding resources, makes recommendations for the best options for Troy. There's 51 different federal broadband loan and grant programs. Communities need help actually navigating those complex processes. And as Troy moves forward now with it on its own project, we anticipate that roadmap's going to be a guide for other communities, help connect the nearly 40% of Montanans still without reliable connectivity. We know that already in 5 years, efforts to expand broadband have made a meaningful difference for our Montana students. Our future progress on that issue will bring economic opportunity then to those rural communities, also ensure that they have the resources to thrive. This really is an area where I think governors can make a difference and find solutions, especially if we look for ways to engage in partnerships and as governors continue to work together. The policies and innovative ideas that we can put into place to enhance broadband in both our rural and our urban area communities have an impact on every person that we serve. So thanks for allowing me to share a little bit of Montana's successes and challenges with all of you. And now I'd like to turn it over to Governor Polis of Colorado.
Thank you, Governor Bullock. Colorado is a very diverse state geographically and from a demographic perspective. Cities, Colorado Springs, Denver, Aurora, suburbs, exurbs, rural areas. So we kind of have a swath of it all, including difficult geographic terrain, mountains, high plains. But as we know, in the 21st century, broadband is absolutely critical infrastructure that everyone needs. It's not just about the consumer experience, which it is, whether it's Netflix or Amazon or Hulu, whatever you're using. And by the way, that's the consumer expectation. If you want to attract millennials to live in an area, they have to have that. But it's a lot more than that, too. It's also about a better education for young people. It gives rural businesses connectivity they need to compete in a global economy. It's about telecommuting opportunities for people who can have location-independent employment, living in some of those beautiful areas in the country and be able to telecommute. Not just what you might call high-end jobs. You traditionally might think telecommuting, maybe they're an architect or an attorney. It also means it can be high school educated folks working in a call center virtually, living in a community that has lower cost of living and a higher quality of life. High-speed connectivity is also a lifeline for first responders, telemedicine, really critical for people's health as well. In Colorado, 86% of our rural households have access to broadband. Our goal is to increase it to 92% by 2020, by mid this year, 100% by 2024, so in just 4 years. We have a state broadband deployment board at our Department of Regulatory Affairs, which has committed over $19 million since 2016 for the last mile infrastructure. And our Department of Local Affairs is spending $5 million per year for the middle mile infrastructure to help get access to some of our more remote communities. The year before I took office, our legislature enacted regulations to prevent existing internet providers from easily capturing grants from new operators. We want to draw new market entrants. I also signed legislation that allows broadband providers to tap into electrical easements that already exist. So we can start building, we can remove barriers to building broadband without having to deal with the myriad of property ownership issues that can prevent the construction of new infrastructure. So we engage with our private sector partners. We have a couple towns that have done municipal broadband, generally smaller towns. But when you take the problem holistically, it's important to note that we have to get there. The economic benefits of getting there are great. As well as helping to meet the overall goals of rural economic success. When we launched our blueprint for rural economic prosperity the expansion of high-speed connectivity to our rural communities was really front and center, critical for small businesses and Main Street retailers, just as it is for people who might telecommute from home or need to access life-saving medical services from home. So I look forward to engaging with the other governors as we work to optimize our strategy to expand connectivity across our state.
Thank you, Governor Polis. Questions, comments, things happen in other states. Governor Kelly.
Yeah. Actually, Governor Bullock, I'm very intrigued by your discussion of Troy and the fact that you've got connectivity at your schools and you're looking for ways to expand that. I think there's actually an article in the New York Times today that talks about Cottonwood Falls, Kansas, where we have exactly the same thing. Cottonwood Falls is dead center, Kansas. So the school district has connectivity, but the community does not, and it's actually losing businesses, and certainly businesses are refusing to move in because they don't have this access. So you figured out some way to fund it for the school. Do you have a plan for funding to expand outside the school?
You know, the challenge, and it is a real challenge as much as for these smaller towns too, because on the one hand, it may not look like it's cost effective to even be laying the fiber along the way. I mean, I'd love to, not supposed to be putting pitches in for necessarily private companies, but we had folks from Deloitte that went up there and spent several weeks engaging all the stakeholders, really put together that plan of how that they can get there. And then we're doing it again with them for one of our tribal nations where connectivity just doesn't exist. And it's bringing all the stakeholders together, figuring out, but I don't have necessarily a pot of money that I can, from the state level, to give to a community like Troy. What I can do is try to marshal the resources and also recognize the myriad of programs that you can also get from a federal loan and grant program that exist. Other questions, comments, what you're doing in your state? Oh, Governor Burgum.
First of all, Governor Polis, Governor Bullock, congrats on all the great work you're doing. And I would say maybe it's a part of the question to Governor Kelly, but having the same issue of once we got all the schools connected, in this interconnected world, we got to get it out to every combine, every tractor, every rancher on a horse, everybody that's out, monitoring any kind of energy activity. You got to get it to every of the 2,000 wind towers we have in our state, and some of that may have to go wireless, for that last mile, and so we're trying to explore a number of different things where, whether it's TV white spaces, which is spectrum that's available, whether it's other forms of extended wireless, but that's one of the things that we're trying to do because it's just not cost effective to actually string the fiber all that extra distance. But you guys are doing some great work. Keep it up. It's when your states do well, it makes we can use that as examples to help push stuff forward in ours. So we all climb the ladder when we're pushing each other. One thing I would say that when we get all the schools connected, which we have, we got a gigabit to every school in North Dakota, and did that through a combination of private sector plus a cooperative of all of the rural telephone cooperatives, and so that has created a thing called the Dakota Carrier Network across the rural co-ops, and they've laid the backbone, and then we're able to get everywhere. But then when we've got every school connected, now we run into the situation we talked about earlier with the cyber issues. So we did push through last year, which we think may be the first cyber curriculum for every grade level. And we wouldn't think about it like, what does a second grader have to know to be safe when they're connected doing their work at that school? What's a fourth grader have to know? What do you have to know in your junior high? So we've actually created a curriculum and built it in. So instead of just teaching computer science in high school, we're teaching cybersecurity skills at every grade level all the way through, and then also added cybersecurity as a course for people to be able to take in high school in addition to the computer science, because it's a growing field and there's hundreds of thousands of cyber jobs that are available. So it's got a both protect students but a long-term workforce component, and we'd be happy to share some of the work we did relative to building out that curriculum and getting it approved by K-12 and moving that forward.
That's great, Governor Burgum. I'd also say to Governor Kelly and others too, if you ask, let me have a map of my state and all of who has broadband access and who doesn't, it's not an easy thing to get, right? Because it's all private entities, and sharing that information makes it that much more difficult. I mean, we have been undertaking just trying to get broadband mapping. And another thing that I think we all have to think about, like we all talk about trying to get these big infrastructure projects and proposals through our legislature. And I've never included broadband as part of the definition of that infrastructure. You know, it's because there's such unmet water, sewer needs, schools, bridges. But we really do have to start thinking of it as not only that economic driver, but I think as base infrastructure. So if local communities like a Troy or the one that you referenced could also look to some pot of money at the state level as well to help facilitate that. Other thoughts, questions? Yes.
Yeah, actually, Governor Bullock, we have started to include it in our infrastructure plan. You know, we've got a new 10-year comprehensive transportation plan before the legislature right now, and part of that plan includes, you know, as long as digging, you know, and then lay the fiber. That won't get us the last mile, but it'll get us a long way down the road.
Governor Reynolds.
We have made an investment at the state level, and really for a relatively small investment, if you leverage private sector funding, you can really start to make a difference. So I asked the legislature for $20 million, which allowed me to leverage $120 million private sector funding. I was able to get 5. We had 1.3 held. So with 6.3 million, we were able to implement 17 projects in the state of Iowa. And then we stacked that with USDA funding that came in. We qualified for 4 projects. And so with a relatively smaller investment, we've been able to really scale some of these rural areas and provide them the connectivity that they need to survive. We're not going to grow rural Iowa without connectivity. We're not going to get our young people to stay in those communities, and it impacts every single thing that we did. So I'm back this year asking for another $15 million to continue to leverage not only the private sector, but to take advantage of the federal funding that's there too, and I think they're coming out with more opportunities for states to take advantage of that.
It's great. And at the Western Governor's breakfast this morning, we had a number of cabinet folks there, and one of them said that there may be additional opportunities for federal dollars to either match or other complement, but also, Governor Hogan, as you're looking at, you'd mentioned earlier today, of trying to put together overall ideas for what the federal government could do. I mean, those investments in rural infrastructure, if we're ever really going to be that country where everybody has that opportunity to succeed educationally and economically, we can't leave rural communities behind, and that's an area where the federal government can help fill some of the gaps.